Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. This is Ben Maddox here. I'm actually going to hand things over to Michael Eisman to get us started, and I will rejoin you on the latter half of today's broadcast to discuss some of the specifics of today's farm. Just a reminder that we do have a question and answer session at the end of every webinar. You can submit questions here in the webinar app, and we'll get to those once we finish up the main part of the webinar. And if you haven't already, please go check out the preview of this farm, which is available on acretrader.com. You can see a lot of the information we're presenting there on the preview page as well. So without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Michael.
Thanks, Ben. And yeah, we'll actually upload a recording of this to that the farm overview as well. But today we'll be discussing the Birch Creek Farm, which is in Northeast Arkansas. We've got a few disclaimers here, just that this is educational, not investment advice, and that all investments have risk. Ben, if you could move through to those slides, and then we'll do a quick introduction to ourselves. My name is Michael Eisman. I lead our investor relations efforts here at AcreTrader. Prior to AcreTrader, I had some experience with an entrepreneurial support organization. We helped with early stage companies, both in capital formation and product market fit. Worked with hundreds of different entrepreneurs and early stage companies during that part of my career, and that was how I met the team at AcreTrader, and have been incredibly excited both by the market opportunity here and the team surrounding this. And so I'll let Ben introduce himself as well. We're just two of now almost 30 people on this team that are doing an incredible amount of diligence and in effort sourcing these farms prior to bringing them up to the platform.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, this is Ben Maddox, Director of Farm Operations here. My primary role on the team is leading the acquisition, due diligence, and management of all the properties you see. If you've joined us on previous webinars before, you might be familiar with me. Prior to AcreTrader, I worked a lot in international agriculture, so I have a pretty diverse background in the different types of properties, crops, and value chains that I've had exposure to in the past. And I am an accredited farm manager with the American Society of Farm Manager and Rural Appraisers. And I'll be, like I mentioned earlier, joining you later on in the broadcast to talk about the specific property.
And before we go into those details, we just want to remind you kind of how the AcreTrader platform works, and then also why we're so interested in farmland and farmland investing. At the highest level, AcreTrader was created to connect investors with farmland. We have a simple platform where accredited investors are able to buy shares of individual farms in the United States, and we help farmers grow their operation with new financing options that may not have existed previously. And you may think about, well, if I'm going to invest in farmland, why not just buy a whole farm myself? And you can. There's plenty of people doing that, but the short answer is it's very difficult to invest in farmland. And there's some additional hurdles as well. One is it's difficult to manage if you are not in that local community, and it's also difficult to find the offerings if you're not in that local community because they're not publicly listed in many cases. Also, if you're going to make an allocation into farmland, it's nice to be able to diversify within the asset class rather than just into the asset class. If you're making an allocation of $1 or $2 million, that may just be tied up in one farm or two farms, and you're not able to get geographic or kind of spread that across different aspects. And then if you're going to operate the farm, there's a lot of additional complexities in that as well. And so many investors, even if they're interested in farmland, have not been able to access the asset class. And so AcreTrader's solution is very simple for the investors. Our team here is identifying the parcels, and then we're creating a unique LLC. And Ben, if you move to the next slide here, this demonstrates the simplicity for the investor's perspective. We place that parcel in the LLC, and then we have a management agreement with that LLC to handle all of the administration, which would primarily be leasing it out to a farmer, collecting that rent, handling all the admin with the LLC, and making it a completely passive investment for the investors on the platform. And if you're still thinking, why farmland? Farmland has been a pretty incredible asset class with consistently high returns and limited volatility. This is a slide that you may have seen before or seen on our investors page on the website, but the vertical axis here is the average annual growth rate. This would be returns over time. Farmland returns are primarily comprised of two factors. One would be the annual distributions, the annual rent that someone would pay to operate there. And then the second part would be the appreciation of the land over time. And that would obviously be whenever the farm is sold, is when investors would realize the appreciation. The x-axis here is the volatility, or the essentially price swings over time. Farmland has less debt utilized. There's a few other considerations where it has had fewer market swings, or just less correlation even with the overall market that has positioned it here at that top left part of this chart. And one of the large macro factors that we see in farmland in general is not going away. The idea of there's less land available and there's more mouths to feed. The American Farmland Trust has actually published that it's 3 acres a minute that are disappearing of farmland, primarily to development, but also erosion and other factors as well. And this chart is the arable acres per capita in the United States. So it's continuing to decline, and this basically shows that there's continuing to be more people and less farmland available to grow crops. And these are factors that we do not see changing. And so while any market can have upswings and downswings, these are this is one of the major macro factors that has us so excited about farmland investing in general. But you can't just buy any farm and expect to have strong returns. There's a lot that goes into it, and there's not necessarily a market listing service or Zillow where you can compare every house in the neighborhood and determine what the market value is and what kind of deal you're going to be getting. There's a lot that goes into the diligence behind the farms before we bring them to the AcreTrader platform. And we won't dive into every aspect that we are looking at, or really Ben and his team are evaluating prior to putting a farm under contract. But we did want to offer some of the highest level, or buckets that we're considering what makes an investment grade farm. Soil is one where we need to have strong historic yield or historic production on the farm, and you need productive soil to grow crops. The second would be water, and water is going to vary pretty broadly depending on where you are in the country. In the Midwest, you may be looking for drainage because their soils retain a lot more water and there's sufficient rainfall. So you don't see as many irrigated farms. You may see drainage tile that is important to make sure that there's not too much water on the farm. In the Mississippi Delta, there's plenty of farms that are irrigated, and so you're looking for sufficient water, but also the irrigation infrastructure in place to make sure that you're able to bring the water up to those sandier soils. And then out west, there's many places where water can be a concern, especially California is not a surprise to many of you. You want to make sure that you have water rights and that you're going to have sustainable water for the future of the productive life of that farm. And next would be the financial profile. That's primarily the rent, as I mentioned previously, that you would have paid out each year, and then the opportunity for appreciation. And then there's some extrinsic considerations, I guess higher level, looking at the region. Is this a strong farming community with a strong tenant market, and are the land values continuing to appreciate over time? So this is just a summary of some of the things that we're looking at. We are looking at hundreds of farms every month and narrow it down to probably 4 or 5 that come up on the platform. And these are the things that we are evaluating prior to bringing these farms up on the platform. And before diving into the specific farm today, we wanted to spend a little bit of time on macro trends or things that we're seeing in farmland overall. The first would be, this is a row crop farm, and there's a lot of concentration in different commodities in row crop farming across the United States. So there's about 300 million acres of cropland, and you can see 230 million acres are represented just in this chart here. Primarily corn and soybean are the two most grown crops in the United States. And we wanted to highlight this because it is feasible to build a pretty diverse portfolio of farmlands and still stay in some of these main commodities. Sometimes there's even more predictability in the returns there because there are more farmers renting out those farms, and so the tenant availability is very strong. And the second point is that there's no such thing as just a corn farm or just a soybean farm. Today's farm actually has grown 4 different commodities in recent years, and most farms are in some sort of crop rotation plan. The reason that these are highlighted here and there's more of them grown is because it's most profitable for the farmers to grow them. And if that changed over time, we would see this chart change as well. A row crop farm is not necessarily a bet just on one commodity, but it's an option to produce any of the commodities that climate and soil type is able to produce. And so One more kind of concentration piece before we go into the Birch Creek Farm is geographically. If you were to build a farmland portfolio across all 50 states and had one farm in each state, it wouldn't necessarily represent the way that agriculture is spread across the different United States. You can see that the top 15 states, and this is gross agricultural revenues per state, are represented here, and this is a large majority of the country's agricultural production. You'll see it's primarily concentrated in three main regions. The West Coast and California plays a big role there. There's actually a lot of organic vegetable production, a lot of tree nuts up there as well. The Midwest is another area where, if you think about the Corn Belt, that would be Illinois, Iowa, Indiana. There's a really strong farmland community there. And then the Southeast, or the Mississippi Delta, is the area surrounding Mississippi River, where you have a very strong aquifer being recharged by the largest river in the country, in great soils that support a very diverse crop production. And that's actually where the farm this week is located, in Arkansas. And so I'll turn it over to Ben for the rest of the presentation here, and join you again for the Q&A at the end.
Thank you, Michael. You've got some photos here of today's investment, today's property. These pictures are from a few weeks ago, obviously before spring planting efforts began in earnest. This is in Northeast Arkansas. We had a pretty good freeze here the other night, and so there's guys just now getting up and getting out to getting crops started out there. But this probably was about 3 or 4 weeks ago, these photos. Moving forward, you got a regional view here. I mentioned it was in Northeast Arkansas. The property sort of bridges two separate counties, Craighead and Greene County, in extreme Northeast Arkansas. That is because there's 3 parcels involved in today's farm. You can see there, it's just northeast of the town of Jonesboro. Jonesboro is really the hub of agriculture in Northeast Arkansas. There's a ton of excellent farmers in this area. It's part of the reason we like the farm. You can also see just faintly white line there, that is the Missouri state line. So it's pretty close to the state of Missouri as well. Here we have the executive summary. You can see the 3 parcels there. All 3 parcels are fully irrigated, 2 with furrow irrigation and 1 with a center pivot. The farm is being sold as a sale-leaseback, with the seller farmer committing to a 5-year lease agreement. And it's worth noting this Craighead, Greene County area is home to some of the highest values and most productive lands in the Arkansas Delta. So this is Northeast Arkansas, is definitely where a lot of the action is in terms of larger farmers, some of the better soils, and it's an area that we like to see farmland in. The investment highlights, as I mentioned, this is an off-market transaction in a really competitive farming area. Competitive not only in the sense that you don't see a lot of public sales of good ground in this area, but also competitive in terms of renting. So there are a lot of farmers looking to pick up more acres in this area. The second item, I alluded to this earlier, or Michael alluded to this earlier, I should say, there's really high quality soils that give you crop optionality. So 4 different crops have been produced over the last 4 or 5 years on this farm, which really gives you a lot of ability to sort of respond to what markets are doing. Obviously, water is always something we focus on our investments. This one is no different. There's access to really great irrigation water, all recharged by the Mississippi River. Each parcel has its own well. So there's all going into the alluvial aquifer there. As is pretty common in the Southeast, we have historically low property taxes in this region. So that obviously contributes to a higher net return for investors. And finally, this is a long-term lease back with an experienced farmer on this property. Getting into the tract analysis, these are all really light, well-drained, fine, sandy loams. We've talked about light soils and heavy soils on webinars in the past. For those who are new to investing with AcreTrader and to our webinars, put really simply, lighter soils are those that are going to allow you to grow crops like cotton and corn. Heavier soils are typically reserved for corn and soybeans. Typically, all things held equal and constant, there's a slightly higher value attributed to the lighter soils. Doesn't make them necessarily better farm or a worse farm. It just means you can grow a few more crops on them, and because of that optionality, they typically have received higher values over time. This tract 1 is furrow irrigated. Tract 2 is actually very similar. Really, the main difference is that it has a center pivot to irrigate it. Again, fine sandy loams, light and well drained, could grow corn, cotton, soybeans, all the above. And really, the only tract that is different among the three is tract 3. And it's not all that different. It's furrow irrigated like tract 1, but this farm in particular has grown a little bit of rice, where the other two have had less rice production on them in the past. We've actually used this slide before, the Mississippi alluvial aquifer. So in the Mississippi Delta, there are really two main aquifers. There's the alluvial aquifer, which is recharged by Mississippi River water, and there's a much deeper Sparta aquifer. When possible, you want to be able to tap into the alluvial aquifer as it's much shallower, therefore the wells are less expensive to put in. And so all these wells are in that aquifer. As I mentioned, there's one for every parcel. And here you have the irrigation, how the water is delivered via irrigation for each parcel, as well as the average rainfall. Obviously we get a pretty heavy amount of rain here in Arkansas. That our office is actually based on the northwest corner of the state, a few hours drive from this farm. But we get quite a bit of rainfall here to supplement all of the groundwater irrigation that we put out on the fields. Moving on to the financial section, you can see here the price per acre as well as the minimum investment. So it is a $20,790 minimum investment. You have the gross cap rate as well as the net return. So you have all of that here. This is all on the preview farm page. If you go to the financials tab, if you're new to AcreTrader, you will have to create an account and log in to get to the financials tab. But all this information is there, as well as all the sort of line item expenses with respect to property taxes and insurance. Looping back to our takeaway slide here, give me just a moment as it loads. We explored these a little bit earlier. I'm going to come back to these during the question and answer session. Michael actually has 2 slides on the investment process he's going to cover before we get to Q&A. You can go ahead and start submitting your questions. I'll be pulling those up now while Michael covers the last slides here, but I will pull this one back up as we move into that Q&A session.
Great, thanks, Ben. I just wanted to highlight quickly here the investment process, kind of what to expect. As Ben noted earlier, it was 30 shares. So a share is actually 1/10 of an acre. That'd be the equivalent to buying 3 acres. As long as you meet that minimum investment, you can increase your investment by any increment of right around $700 for this farm. And then you'll be prompted with, how do you want to hold the investment? Your ownership options would be an individual account, which is what your account defaults to, but you can also add an entity, an LLC, a trust, a self-directed IRA. There's a number of different entity options that you can hold shares in. If you want to get ahead of the game, you can go into your user dashboard and add that entity, have that verified. There's a quick identity verification process before that. After you select your entity, that will populate your allocation and your entity on the investment agreement, which you can sign electronically through DocuSign, and then you're prompted with how do you want to fund your investment. Your funding options would be linking your bank account directly, which is preferred because it makes distributions much easier. We can just send you funds electronically rather than mailing you a check. But you do also have the options to do a one-time ACH, where you would just enter in your routing and account number for the bank account you would like to send the funds from, or copy down wire instructions and send them manually after the investment. Finally, there's an accredited investor verification. This is something that we need to do from a regulatory perspective. Based on the way that our offerings are listed, we have to verify that investors meet the accreditation standards. There's information about that on our website, but we just want to make sure that you're prepared to upload a document that verifies either your net worth is over $1 million, your income is over $200,000 over the last couple of years, or some of the other accredited investor, verification methods. We are able to recognize if someone has invested recently, and so fortunately we're able to leave you as accredited in our system if you've invested in the last 90 days for net worth, or been verified for your income in the last year. Finally, kind of what to expect throughout the life cycle of the investment. Tomorrow the investment window will open up and you can purchase shares. Soon after, once all of the funds have been collected and we schedule the title transfer, we'll show you the deed after that is purchased. We usually have annual distributions, sometimes semi-annually, but usually it's an annual distribution in December with your portion of the rent that will be delivered to your AcreTrader wallet. We send biannual reports with what's happening on your farm, planting updates, harvest updates, any improvements that we'll be making. You have a K1 that's sent out through your user dashboard each year for each entity that you invest in. And then the exit strategy, each farm has a we don't have a predetermined buyer, whether it will be a neighboring farmer or who will be the potential buyer, but usually there's a 5 to 10 year window for when we expect to sell the farm. At that point, you would have your initial investment plus any appreciation returned, and that would usually be in the form of capital gains, long-term capital gains. It would come through on the K1 as well and be distributed to your AcreTrader account. So Ben, I'll turn it back over to you for taking the first couple questions here.
Yeah, just a reminder, you can submit questions now. If we don't get to them during the session here, we will respond to you by the end of the day. The farm is going to go live at 1 p.m. tomorrow on Friday. So that's Central Time, 1 p.m. And obviously, we've got our contact information here if you have any additional questions that aren't asked today. So let me get back to this slide, and I'll begin answering a few questions I was taking a look at as Michael was working there. So the first question here is, what are your thoughts about, and let me turn on my camera here so you guys can see us, my apologies. There's a question here about what are your thoughts about carbon credits and participating in some of those markets? So pretty common question we get, and I think it's the whole story about carbon credits is really interesting. I think a big picture take is, those markets are very immature right now, and so they're still sort of forming, building the rules around them. Farmers are still figuring out how to participate. I could tell you there was a study that came out, just in the last couple of weeks, and they did a survey of farmers participating in different carbon markets and found that, the average farmer, should they participate in one of the different carbon credit programs, would make about $20 an acre. So you got to remember, farmer gross revenue per acre is anywhere from, it's a broad swath depending on what you're growing, anywhere from $500 to $1,000 an acre. So $20 an acre in revenue is a relatively small amount of revenue to receive for the work involved. A lot of farmers right now feel like the cost of participating in carbon markets currently outweigh that, $20 or so per acre that they get for participating. So I think long term, we're going to have to see the price of carbon credits move upwards before you really get broad adoption among farmers who are very interested in finding alternative sources of revenue for their farms. But obviously it has to make sense from a financial standpoint at the end of the day. So that's sort of a short take on carbon credits. We're certainly watching it here, hope to participate in the future, but it's still pretty early days.
Ben, I see a couple questions here that I can take, and I'll let Ben handle most of the farm-specific questions. But people are asking, how can you redeem funds from your wallet? If you link a bank account, you can just move funds back and forth from your bank account to your wallet. You don't need to have your wallet pre-funded. You can initiate a transfer during the investment process, but it's a pretty easy process to move funds in and out. And then there's a question about the kind of the deal structure here, and this LLC will be purchasing the title and then just leasing it out to a farmer. And a question is why not list it publicly? As Ben mentioned, this is a sale-leaseback scenario where if a farmer were to list this publicly, then they would likely be selling it to someone else who would be operating the farm. Working with AcreTrader is a way to keep this farm as part of their operation, but reinvest the capital from the farm or the equity in other areas of their business.
Yep. There is a question here about if there's high inflation, is there protection in the lease rate against that inflation, essentially? So the answer to that question is it does depend on every lease. I can say in this case, and in a lot of cases when we have these longer 3 to 5 year term leases, we will build in sort of an inflation escalator. So a lot of times what you'll see is usually in year 3, start building a 2% annual increase in the cash rent on the property. And that is to keep up with the, obviously the inflation going on. So yes, is the short answer. Frequently our cash leases will have an inflation escalator in them, and that is the intention on this property.
And I do see a couple questions about exit value, return projections. So usually the way that we build out a return projection for row crop farms like this, the average annual appreciation for row crop farms has been 5.9% annually over the last 50 years. That's the USDA's data set's the largest data set available. And so rather than mark-to-market projections or trying to put a pin on exactly where the market will be 8 years from now, we use that to project out the return. And so that 8.2 figure that you see for the net annualized return, that does include some appreciation as well. We hope that it's better than average historical appreciation, and that would be additional upside to investors. But we try to just be conservative here, not do mark-to-market speculation there, but use the average in order to make these models.
Oh, there's a question here. What is the farm growing? So the farm has historically grown cotton, rice, corn, and soybeans. And again, it could grow more crops than that. There's certainly a few specialty crops around in this area, but those are the most common crops in this Craighead and Greene County area. And any farm that can grow a combination of the four of them will obviously be more valuable due to the optionality that provides.
Ben, I did see some questions about irrigation. I don't know if you saw that, but you used some buzzwords in our presentation about different types of irrigation.
Yep, I see that one. So there's a question here about, can you explain a little bit more, what is furrow irrigation, what is pivot irrigation? So put very briefly, the two predominant ways of irrigating fields, one would be furrow, which is essentially where you make small ditches, almost like alleyways down the field. You provide water through poly pipe at the end of the field, and it essentially rolls down the field, which is on a grade. The other type I mentioned is pivot irrigation. That's actually a machine that turns around one center pivot in a circle and essentially provides sprinkler irrigation from overhead to the field rather than applying it sort of on the ground itself. All things considered equal, center pivot is a little bit more efficient in terms of water usage, but it is a little bit more expensive. Typically, you would use a center pivot when your field has a little bit of a roll to it, because it would be difficult, obviously, to deliver water on a grade across the ground if there's a roll to the field. So center pivot, more efficient in water usage, a little bit more expensive to install. Furrow irrigation is relatively cheap to use, but obviously you have to have a field that is already leveled to some sort of grade so you can get the water to roll.
We do often have questions on depreciation and how that's treated. So, land itself is not something that can be depreciated. I'm not a tax advisor, nor is Ben, but in the tax code, that's not something that could be depreciated, but other fixed assets could. And so improvements like irrigation, drainage, those can be depreciated throughout the life of the investment and pass through on the K1 as well.
There's a question here, do you only use cash rent? The answer to that is no. A lot of this is driven and determined by sort of local custom. So here at AcreTrader, we have farms in 12 different states. Each of those states kind of has a different way that they think about rents. In Arkansas, I can say cash rent is sort of predominant, at least in this area of the state. If you get up into Iowa and Illinois, you'll see things called flex leases, which have sort of a floor rent and then a participation or a bonus type rent paid if crop prices or yields exceed certain thresholds. A lot of the farms in the past we've had in the Midwest had that feature built in. But in the case of Arkansas and Mississippi, for example, you'll primarily see cash rent.
Yeah. There's a question here on our fee structure, and we do always try to be as transparent as possible on this. So I want to, so let's see, apart from the 0.75% annual management fee, are there any other fees payable to AcreTrader or its affiliates in the deal? So throughout the life of the investment, that 0.75% annual management fee, that's paid to AcreTrader to handle all of that management and administration. That's the only annual expense or revenue that goes to AcreTrader. On the front end and back end, there's not a finder's fee or a promote or carry in the deal that AcreTrader has, but we do have a wholly owned real estate brokerage that can represent the farm in the transaction. So on the front end, that would be a buy side commission. It's paid by the seller, not by investors in the entity. The price that we're paying is the price that you're getting. You can see all of that on the financials tab within the preview farm. As Ben mentioned, it's already available on the website right now. On the back end, again, rather than taking 20% of the profit or the gains, AcreTrader again has a wholly owned brokerage. It would represent the farm as the seller's agent there. So there's a 5% total commission. We would likely split that between our ourselves as a seller's agent and a buyer's agent. So that would be paid out to AcreTrader. Usually these brokerage commissions are paid out to an external broker, and then a fund manager would have their own fees on top of that. Because we can capture that, we just pass everything else back to the investors, but the incentives are still aligned there to sell it for as much as possible in that exit scenario.
Well, Michael, I've got 1:30 Central Time on the watch here. Go ahead and wrap it up. Again, as always, if we didn't answer your question, we will do so this afternoon, either by email or by giving you a call. Thank you all for your questions. And the farm will be live at 1 Central Time tomorrow on the AcreTrader website. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Ben.